I didn't understand the weight in her voice at first, the trembling way she said his name as if it carried a history she'd never let me see. But as the days unfolded and the pieces began slipping out of place, I found myself standing in the middle of a life that no longer felt like mine. I remember the night she told me her ex was dying, how she sat on the edge of our bed with her hands clasped so tightly they shook, insisting she needed closure, insisting she couldn't ignore someone she once cared for, insisting it was the right thing to do. I tried to be supportive, I really did, but something about the way she avoided my eyes, the way her phone never left her hand afterward, the way she seemed half present even when she was sitting right beside me, all of it gnawed at the edges of my trust. And then came the late nights, the sudden errands, the strange tension in her smile whenever I asked how he was doing. I kept telling myself compassion wasn't a crime, that she was simply overwhelmed, that I was imagining the shift in the air around us. But eventually, the truth surfaced in a way I could no longer ignore, a truth that hollowed me out and left me wondering how long she had been slipping away from me under the guise of sympathy. And as I stood there staring at the evidence of everything she had been hiding, only one question echoed through my mind. How do you forgive someone who uses another man's supposed dying wish as the perfect cover to betray you? When everything started, my name was still something she said with warmth. My wife Hannah and I had been married for almost 9 years, long enough to accumulate a comfortable rhythm built from shared mornings, late-night conversations, and the quiet, mundane details of domestic life that most people overlook. We weren't perfect. No marriage is. But we understood each other in ways that made me believe our connection was stable, even unshakable. I thought we were past the era of dramatic revelations and emotional upheavals. We had built a life that felt safe, predictable, ours. But the moment she mentioned her ex-boyfriend's name, Elliot, something shifted in her posture, in the room, in my understanding of the person sitting beside me. It was subtle, barely perceptible at first, but it was enough to plant a quiet unease deep in my chest. She brought him up one evening in the kitchen while chopping vegetables, the slices uneven, her hands moving slower than usual. She said she had received a message out of nowhere, something vague and emotional. She said he was sick, terminally, according to him, and he wanted to apologize for the way things ended years ago. She said it as though she expected me to be angry or threatened. But I wasn't, at least not then. I was curious, cautious, but not fearful. I trusted her. She had never given me reason not to. I asked her if she wanted to respond, and she nodded slowly, almost reluctantly, saying she felt she owed him at least a kind acknowledgement. The first message led to a second, then to a conversation, then to a late-night phone call she took in the living room while she thought I was asleep. The next morning, she told me she had trouble resting because she was thinking about Elliot's condition. She spoke with a softness I rarely heard, sympathy mixed with nostalgia, as though she were mourning not just his health, but the version of herself that once belonged to that part of her past. I tried not to overanalyze it. I told myself compassion was a normal response when someone you once loved received terrible news. I had exes too, memories I could revisit without feeling tempted or conflicted. Still, something about the way she avoided giving too many details unsettled me. She said he had cancer, rare, aggressive. She said he didn't have long. She said he had always regretted how he handled their breakup. She said he wanted to make amends before it was too late. The story felt plausible, tragic even, but the vagueness clung to the edges of every conversation. I asked what kind of cancer. She hesitated. I asked how long he had been sick. She didn't know. She told me she didn't want to pry. I didn't push then, but a quiet discomfort began wriggling into the cracks of my trust like water seeping into wood. Over the following days, her demeanor shifted in ways I recognized only in hindsight. She grew more distracted, more emotionally distant, more protective of her phone. She took it everywhere, into the bathroom, the laundry room, even outside when she let the dog out. She angled the screen away from me without making it obvious, She responded to messages with a seriousness that didn't match the casual tone she claimed their conversations carried. I asked her once if she wanted to talk about her feelings, and she smiled, thin, forced, and said she just needed time to process everything. What stood out most was the guilt in her eyes. She didn't seem guilty about talking to Elliot. She seemed guilty about something she hadn't yet admitted to herself, something forming beneath the surface of her good intentions. But instead of confronting it, she insisted on helping him. She said it was cruel to ignore someone dying alone. She said she would never forgive herself if she turned her back on a man who had once been meaningful to her. I didn't argue. I wanted to be supportive, but my instincts buzzed with a tension I couldn't articulate. Then came the first meeting. She told me Elliot had asked to see her, not to rekindle anything, she insisted, but to apologize in person, to give himself peace in whatever time he had left. She said she didn't want to go alone, but she also said she didn't want me there because she didn't want him to feel awkward or ashamed. The contradiction stung in a way I tried to pretend it didn't. She said it was just a conversation, that she would be gone for an hour, that she would feel better afterward. When she returned later that afternoon, her demeanor was radically different. Her eyes were glossy, but not from crying, more like she had been pulled into an emotional current she hadn't expected. She hugged me tightly at the door, but instead of comfort, the gesture felt like an apology she wasn't saying out loud. I asked how it went. She said it was strange, but good. When I asked for details, she brushed them aside, claiming it was too personal, too emotional, too complicated to summarize. That night was the first time I saw her cry in the bathroom with the water running. She came to bed late, sliding under the covers quietly, pretending she hadn't been crying at all. I pretended I didn't notice. That was the beginning of the slow unraveling. The second meeting happened 3 days later, then a third a week after that, each time under the same premise, giving him comfort, closure, peace. I wanted to trust her, I really did. But the secrecy grew thicker, turning into a fog that clouded every interaction. She started leaving the house at odd hours, early mornings, late evenings, always with some flimsy explanation that she delivered with too much hesitation to be believable. She would sit on the couch with a faraway look in her eyes, as though her body were present, but her thoughts were miles away. Eventually, I asked the question I had been avoiding. "Do you still have feelings for him?" She froze, completely. Then she shook her head too quickly, too forcefully. She said she was just confused, that seeing him so fragile brought up things she hadn't expected, that compassion can look like attachment even when it isn't. Her explanation wasn't satisfying, but it wasn't incriminating either. I let it rest because the alternative felt too painful to consider. But as her emotional absence grew, our physical intimacy faded too. She stopped initiating affection. She pulled away from small touches. She slept facing the opposite direction most nights. When I asked if she was okay, she insisted she was just tired. But exhaustion doesn't make someone hide their phone under a pillow. Exhaustion doesn't make someone flinch when you mention their ex's name. Exhaustion doesn't create a secret world accessible only through late-night messages and unexplained absences. The turning point came on a Saturday morning. She told me she needed to run errands, something vague about picking up a prescription and grabbing groceries. She left wearing makeup she didn't normally apply for errands and a scarf she only wore when she wanted to feel confident. I watched her leave, something heavy settling in my chest. After she pulled out of the driveway, I wrestled with myself for nearly an hour before the anxiety became too loud to ignore. I decided to drive the route toward the pharmacy, telling myself I just wanted reassurance. But halfway there, I saw her car at a small cafe tucked behind a row of shops, far from any grocery store or pharmacy. My instincts tightened. Inside, I saw her through the window. She wasn't alone. Elliot leaned across the table toward her, alive, animated, entirely unlike the image of the dying man she had described. She wasn't crying or comforting a man in despair. She was smiling softly, leaning in the same way she used to lean toward me when we were young and still learning each other. They weren't discussing grief or closure. They were sharing something intimate, familiar, dangerously comfortable. My stomach twisted so violently I had to grip the steering wheel to steady myself. I didn't go in. I couldn't. I drove home in a haze of disbelief, humiliation, heartbreak, and something deeper. A sense that her betrayal had been quietly unfolding long before I caught a glimpse of it. When she came home hours later, she smelled faintly of the cafe, roasted coffee, and something sweet. She didn't know I had seen. She kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, like someone returning from an afternoon with a friend. She smiled when she spoke, not realizing the smile no longer held the same meaning for me. And as I watched her move through the kitchen, humming softly under her breath, I realized something devastating. She still loved him. Maybe she never stopped. And while she had spent weeks convincing me she was simply comforting a dying man, I finally understood the truth she had been hiding with trembling hands and soft excuses. He wasn't dying at all. She was choosing him behind my back, choosing him while lying to my face. And the part that shattered me most wasn't the affair itself. It was the realization that she loved me enough to stay, but loved him enough to betray me. Those two truths living side by side were the kind that could break a person in half. And I wasn't sure which half of me would survive what I learned next. When I finally confronted her, it wasn't with shouting or accusations or any of the dramatic scenes people imagine when they think of betrayal. It was quieter than that, slower, like the way a tree creaks before it splits. I waited until after dinner, after the kids were asleep, after she'd settled into the couch with a blanket and the soft glow of the television washing over her face. For a moment, I almost convinced myself to let it go, to pretend nothing had changed, to preserve the fragile normalcy we were clinging to. But the truth sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and unmovable. I muted the TV and said her name, and the sound of it coming from my mouth felt different, weighted, tired, careful. She turned toward me with a look that told me she already sensed something was coming, something she didn't want to face. I asked her where she'd been that morning. She repeated the same lie she'd told me before: errands, prescription, groceries. Her voice trembled just slightly at the end, the way it always did when she was trying to navigate between truth and deception. I didn't interrupt her. I let her finish the whole fabricated story, every detail she had probably rehearsed in her mind. And when she was done, I simply said I'd seen her at the cafe. I said it softly, without anger, without accusation, just a fact laid bare between us. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. Her face drained of color, her lips parted slightly, and her hands clenched around the blanket as though it could anchor her in a moment already slipping away. She didn't deny it. She didn't offer a counter-story. She didn't scramble for excuses. She just stared at me with the expression of someone who realizes they've been living in a collapsing house and never noticed the cracks forming. After several long seconds, she whispered an apology, one so faint and fragmented it barely qualified as a word. I asked her if Elliot was dying. She closed her eyes slowly, as if the answer itself were a blade she had to pull from her own skin. And then she shook her head. No, he wasn't dying. He never had been. I didn't know whether to laugh or be sick. She tried to explain how he had reached out claiming he was sick, how she didn't question it at first, how the emotional unraveling between them had happened unexpectedly. But as she spoke, I realized something deeply unsettling. She wasn't confused. She wasn't disoriented. She had allowed herself to believe him because she wanted a reason to open the door he'd knocked on. And once it was open, she didn't bother to close it. I asked her how long she'd been seeing him. She hesitated, biting her lip in a way I had seen countless times before when she was considering whether to lie or confess. "A few weeks," she said. But I watched her eyes, and I knew instantly the truth stretched further than that. One thing about betrayal is that you lose the ability to hear anything at face value. Every syllable becomes a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit the picture. I pressed again, and after a painfully long pause, she admitted it had been months. Months of messages, meetings, emotional intimacy, and then something beyond that, something she refused to articulate but didn't need to. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with a grief so thick it felt physical. She tried to reason with me, insisting she never meant for it to become anything, that she had just wanted to help a man she once cared about. But this wasn't help. This was connection, reconnection, renewal, a resurrection of something buried long before she ever promised her life to me. And she had pursued it quietly, steadily, behind my back while expecting me to carry on as though nothing was changing. I asked her if she loved him. The question hung in the air like smoke. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. Instead, her eyes filled with tears, she tried to blink away and she whispered, "I don't know what I feel." That answer, vague, suspended, indecisive, hurt more than a confession of love would have. Love would have been a direction. Uncertainty was a trap. It left me in a limbo where nothing was clear enough to accept, but everything was painful enough to break me. I spent that night on the couch, staring at the ceiling while she cried silently in our bedroom. The distance between us felt like miles. I kept replaying memories, our wedding day, the birth of our daughter, quiet Sunday mornings making pancakes together. And intertwined with those memories were new images, her smiling across a cafe table at a man she had once given her heart to, and might have been giving it to again. Over the next few days, the house felt colder. Conversations were punctuated by long silences. The kids sensed something was wrong immediately, even though we tried to act normal. Our daughter asked why Mommy wasn't smiling as much. Our son clung to me every time I left the room. It was a strange, painful paradox, how children can feel a shift long before they understand it. At one point, I asked Hannah directly whether she wanted to save our marriage. She didn't answer right away. She stared at the floor, twisting her wedding ring around her finger, a gesture that seemed more symbolic than she realized. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. She said she wanted to, but she didn't know how to shut off the part of her that still felt attached to her past with Elliot. She said seeing him again had stirred old emotions she thought she had buried. She said she was frightened by the way her heart responded to his presence. It was the kind of honesty that should have felt refreshing, but instead it shattered whatever was left of my hope. Because you can fix a fracture, but you can't compete with a ghost. You can't reason with nostalgia. You can't force someone to choose the present if they're still living in the shadow of what used to be. Eventually, I asked to speak with Elliot myself, not to confront him emotionally, but to understand what he was manipulating. He agreed to meet me, surprisingly, and the moment I saw him up close, I understood why Hannah had been drawn back in. He carried himself with a tragic charm, a practiced vulnerability, a softness that masks self-serving intentions. He apologized to me, but it was an apology delivered with the tone of someone who wasn't sorry at all. He said he never meant to cause harm, but he couldn't deny the connection he and Hannah still had. He said people change, lives change, but some bonds never really disappear. His confidence stunned me, not arrogance exactly, but certainty. He believed he had a claim on her heart, and worse, he believed she felt the same. And the truth buried beneath all of this, the truth no one wanted to say aloud, was that she did. Maybe not fully, maybe not decisively, but enough to phrase every answer with hesitation, enough to let everything we built together tremble beneath her uncertainty. I left the meeting with a clarity I hadn't had before, not anger, not jealousy, just understanding. I finally saw that the fight wasn't between me and him. The fight was inside her, and I had no control over it. I could stay and twist myself into impossible shapes trying to compete with a past I was never part of, or I could accept that love does not survive when it becomes an afterthought. When I returned home, I told Hannah I couldn't live in limbo. I told her she needed to decide, but not for me, for herself, for our future, for the integrity of whatever life she wanted to build, for the truth she owed herself, long before she owed anything to me. She cried, but her tears didn't change the fact that she had already stumbled across the line where loyalty becomes optional and betrayal becomes inevitable. We separated quietly. No screaming, no dramatic declarations. Just two people whose paths had diverged long before either of us realized it. She moved into a small apartment temporarily while she figured out therapy, closure, whatever journey she needed to take. I stayed with the kids, not out of ownership, but because emotional steadiness was something I still had to give them. Months passed before I finally understood the most painful part of the entire ordeal. She hadn't cheated because she stopped loving me. She cheated because she stopped understanding herself. And when people lose themselves, they often reach back toward the last place they remember feeling whole, even if that place is built on illusion, manipulation, or nostalgia. Healing didn't come quickly, but it came honestly. In the quiet mornings when I packed lunches for the kids, and in the nights when I slept without imagining the weight of another man's presence in our lives. In the slow realization that heartbreak doesn't kill you. It reintroduces you to who you are without the person who broke you. And as months slipped into a year, I learned something unexpected. Closure doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from finally accepting that the story you believed in wasn't the story someone else was living. And even in the wreckage of that truth, there is space to rebuild, slowly, steadily, with a heart wiser than before.